What is up, guys? Fado82 coming at you with another edition of Rust Cribs. This episode is going to be a little bit different in a few ways. This footage is from the past 2 wipe cycles on Rustopia, but not the current wipe cycle. And what that means is that if you're looking for your base and you're currently playing on the server, it's going to be the next episode of Rust Cribs, but not in this episode. I had to get through a backlog of footage, and I didn't want to delete this footage without being able to show it off. So these bases are beautiful examples of vanilla Rust bases. What that means is this is Rust is what it looks like at this point in time, and these bases were able to be put together in 1 week, a 1 week time span. So if you're playing on a server that has a longer than 1 week wipe cycle, if it's 2 weeks or a month, or perhaps even longer, bases might look a bit different. They'll probably look bigger, much grander in scale. So just compare that, keep that in mind when you're comparing footage. So I'm going to talk a little bit differently in this version of Rust Cribs because I want to do a commentary on base building and some aspects to base building that is something that's not often thought about, but is really an important part of the Rust experience. So these bases require a lot of manpower to put together, lots of planning, and every piece of the base is usually put together with these larger compounds with a lot of intention. So behind every placement is thought. And that is a very interesting aspect to Rust in that these bases are rated by players who have human intelligence, and they're put together by players who have intelligence. So it's something that is a very much a cat and mouse game, and there's always been, I felt, this vibe to Rust where there's this sub-game to Rust, this sort of different layer to it where it's a game within a game, and that game is, the puzzle of base rating and then also of base building. It's something that people get really caught up in, that meta of Rust. Rust is a very hard game to describe to people. We can say it's a survival game, and that's true of Rust. We could say it's a first-person game, and that also is true of it. But, it also, at its core, is very much a building and a rating game, and that's always been a central aspect to Rust, and I don't think that'll change. I hope that doesn't change because that's very, I think, important to the Rust community. But I hope, a lot more options are added in between those two extremes. But I think the issue people have with large compounds is that the amount of resources you need to raid them is just so disproportionate to what you're going to get out of raiding a base like that. And it's frustrating to a lot of players. Raiding was always something that, for me as a player, was rewarding when you got into, say, a loot room and you saw, large stacks of resources, or it may have been, C4, whatever it was at that point in time, was always something that was very exciting. Raiding in Rust right now, it always feels like you lose. And part of that's because you can't really traverse the bases in a way that is quick. And the scale of these compounds, as you can see, requires that you stage for a very long time to be able to put together the raid. Also, we can see in a lot of raid cams that very rarely do raids succeed with large-scale compounds because even with a low number of defenders, the compound is just not able to really be gotten up into. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. There should always be compounds that are extremely difficult to raid, but it happens too quickly right now in Rust, and the raiding is not able to keep up with the building, and they need to be closer to the two to make things more fun. I think that people would have less complaints with the compounds if things were like the ladders that ignored privilege were back in the game, or there was like a grappling hook that could get you up vertically quicker. Something that, wasn't too OP, but maybe that had limited uses, but that could be used to quicken the raiding process and to make even people in the large compounds fear a raid a little bit more than they currently do. So that's one aspect that I wanted to talk about because I think that's why people get salty towards compounds. It's not that they hate the compounds, but they just hate that the amount of effort it takes and sort of the fun that it may have taken out of raiding. I think the devs are probably sensitive to that. I don't know if it's where it is on their radar, but I think that those mechanics will continually be tweaked throughout Rust's development. But we're currently at a point where raiding isn't exciting as it used to be, and I think it could use some type of an overhaul. But another aspect that I wanted to talk about, guys, is the intimate connections that players have to their bases and how bases are part of the lived narrative, that sort of player-driven narrative, of that Rust experience. Each server, each seed has a different opportunity to build a base, a different landscape, a different locale, and those bases become part of the stories that players have. It'll be always, remember that base we built, or, remember that time that, this raid happened on that, and the bases become just characters on the server in some ways. There's ominous bases that you'll use as points of reference. There's these hateful looking bases that you don't even want to attempt to raid, and then there's all sorts of different things you'll see in Rust. But in general, base building in Rust has always been about mitigating against a raid. It's a given that a raid will happen, but the most you can do is manage against that damage and allow them to have a most difficult time getting to your main loot rooms. And there's many ways to achieve that. We don't show a lot of that in the Rust cribs because I believe in players having their privacy. I show more of the cinematic shots, the panoramic shots, in a way to kind of allow you to appreciate what the bases look like, to deconstruct them, but never to show off secrets that players might have, because I believe in the ability of Rust players to keep their secrets. Not the ability, but the necessity of that. As a Rust player, it was something that I always thought was profoundly important, and I wouldn't want someone giving away my secrets. But this base here that you're looking at is a good example of the amount of things that are layered up around a base. Not things, let's be specific. Walls, Fado, walls that were layered around a base in a 1 week time period. So this shows you how difficult it would be for raiders to get up in there, especially without anything that can get up on top of that base in a quick way. It does take some of the fun out of the game, and Rust, even though it is at its core a base building game, it's not necessarily that's not the most interesting aspect of Rust. That's a fun part of Rust, but I think Rust always has to feel like its different elements are closer aligned, if you will. So raiding and base building is something that very much has a symbiotic relationship in terms of the fun of Rust. So guys, I just wanted to say, as we wind this video down, this is a bit of a different episode of Rust Cribs, but don't feel like you have to build big compounds to win Rust. You can't win Rust. It's not anything like that. You can be a weekend warrior, play Rust for a few days, get your buddies together, build a small tower, build a small outpost, have some fights, carve out your little piece of the map, and have fun with it. Rust isn't a game that necessarily requires that you put in the amount of time that you see in these large compounds. As always, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Fado82, peace.